You may be familiar with failover clusters for SQL Server, but how does that change in Azure Virtual Machines? Learn more in this episode of Data Exposed. Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed MVP Edition. Today, I'm joined by Javier Villegas, MVP working on Azure Data. Javier, thanks so much for joining us today. Can you get us started by telling us a little bit about what you do?
Sure, Anna. Hello, everybody. Basically, I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I am Data Platform MVP, and I work at Mediterranean Shipping Company as an IT director in the DBA and BI Services. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer, and I am member of the Azure Data Tech Community Board of Advisors.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you on the show. I think you have the right expertise for what we're going to be talking about today, which is SQL Server failover clusters in Azure. Now, before we get really into the in Azure part, I'd love to understand from you, what is a failover cluster?
Okay, sure. Yeah, a failover cluster is basically a group of computers, of servers that you can put all together to achieve high availability, right, for certain applications or resources. In this case, what we're going to be focusing on is on failover cluster using shared storage, and we're going to discuss specifically SQL Server scenarios, right? Basically, you can have two or more machines in your cluster sharing a group of disk, right? This could be one disk or multiple disk. The beauty of this is that you have one active node being the owner of all the resources. Again, in this case, SQL Server. If something happened to that computer, to that server, let's say that it crashed, or you have a hardware issue, or you need to patch or something, you can easily move all the resources to the other node, right? And the ones that were the passive node of the cluster become the new active node. And you can do that in a matter of seconds, right?
Wow.
Also, it's important to notice that you always have the same SQL Server name and IP address. That means that you don't have to do any changes on your connection string, right? So it doesn't matter which is the node that is serving SQL Server, in this case, right? You don't have to worry about the application. So let's say that you need to have multiple instances of SQL Server. You can add more nodes to the cluster and have some of these nodes serving a specific SQL Server instance. So you can move each of the instances to any of the nodes in a matter of seconds, right? Always having the same SQL Server name and IP address. So this is extremely important. And the shared storage failover clusters are available in Windows since Windows NT 4. So it's a technique that is well proven. And in my case, I've been using it probably since then.
Awesome, cool. It sounds like a very useful technology. And I actually think for some of our Azure SQL PaaS services, this is what we're doing under the hood, actually. But if I wanted to kind of do this in an Azure virtual machine, can I build like a shared storage failover cluster using an Azure VM?
Yes, absolutely. Before going to that, let me also tell you that you can combine a failover cluster instance with an availability group, right, with other cluster nodes in a different data center in a different location. So with that, you can not also achieve high availability, you can also have disaster recovery, right? So this is why it's important to know and have it in your environment, right? So you have the whole solution: high availability and disaster recovery using failover cluster instances, using shared storage, combined with availability group. Here I have some screenshot on how you see the nodes, the disk, and the resources in the window cluster, right, from the failover cluster manager point of view. You can see all the nodes that you have in your cluster, right? You can have also the shared cluster name and IP, and you can also see all the disk, the shared disk that are attached to the cluster. Going back to the question if we can have this in Azure, the answer is yes. Since last year, we have the possibility using premium or ultra disk to have the possibility of having the shared storage cluster. That means that when you create the disk within the Azure portal, you have a new property which is called max shared, meaning how many virtual machines can own that disk or can share that disk, right? So it's as simple as running this command from the Cloud Shell, right? You're gonna create, in this case, a disk which is named my shared disk 2 with certain size. And in this case, I specify that I'm using premium SKU. And the important thing is the max share, right? So with that, you have your disk ready to add to multiple nodes, right? And have the shared storage failover cluster. Right?
And why is the max shares, why is that number, why is that important?
This is important because basically, if you don't do this, when you create a disk in Azure, it's gonna be only owned by one virtual machine at the same time, right? So with this max share option, which is the new part, right, you can have the disk map to multiple virtual machines. Of course, you need the failover cluster manager to govern which is the active node and which one has access to the disk at any particular moment. But the good is that you can have it already connected to the disk, right? And depending on which is the active node, each machine will see all the disks, right? That is why this max shares option is important. You can set it up to 2, 5, 10, whatever, depending on how many nodes you need in your failover cluster. It's also important to consider that when you install SQL Server on a failover cluster, we have to go to a different setup process, right? It's not the one that we know, which is the first option, new SQL Server installation. It's actually new failover cluster installation. And you have to start the installation on the active node. When I say active node is the one owning the disk at that particular moment, right? The disk and all the cluster resources, right? With that, you have to do let's say a SQL Server setup following the installation guide. There's going to be some differences between a regular standalone SQL installation and a failover cluster. And then when you are done with your active node, right, you have to jump to the passive node that, again, you can have more than one, right? And in that case, you have to go to the option add node to the SQL Server failover cluster.
Awesome, thanks. It seems like this is pretty straightforward, very similar to what you would do for SQL Server, but now in an Azure Virtual Machine. One question I had, Javier, can you show us how you would actually go about creating this shared disk in something like the Azure portal?
Yes, absolutely. So let me go to my Azure portal. Here I am logged in my subscription. I have started the Cloud Shell, and here I have my prompt. When I go here, I just have the command that will create, right, the shared disk with 1 terabyte in East US with standard SSD, right, and with the max share option. When I submit the command, it just creates the disk. It's going to take a few seconds to have it complete, but now I will close this. I will refresh my portal, and we will see in a few seconds the shared disk. Here, my shared disk one. So when I go to the disk properties within the portal, this is like any other regular disk that we have for any virtual machines, right? But here we have the option that is saying max shares 2. So this way, when we have multiple virtual machines, in this case 2, we can attach this specific disk to multiple ones, right? And this way we can create multiple disks using the same syntax, right? And we can also combine different SKUs. If you only want to use premium disk or ultra disk or a combination of them, you can do it this way. And if you want to have 4 disks, you can do it this way. It's extremely simple.
Awesome, cool. This has been a really useful session. I've learned a lot. One question I had, which is maybe you can help me with, earlier you talked about creating this failover cluster instance and then adding an availability group. Is that something you see customers or people you work with wanting to do in Azure as well? Is this kind of the way you would get started in doing that, or do you have any tips?
Well, in my particular experience, I do this combination all the time, right? In order to have high availability within the same Azure region, right? You have the availability set, you have the different zones, etc. But if you want to cover the problem where one of your VMs, for example, crashed, you have the other. And for that, I have failover cluster, right? With 2 nodes in my case. And when we want to have, for example, a VM on a different data center, on a different region, right? In my case, we are using West Europe and North Europe, right? We have an availability group, right? And another instance, and a standalone instance actually running on the North Europe data center, and doing an asynchronous availability group synchronization that makes a lot of sense. And eventually, if something happened to the whole region, you can do the HE failover, right, from one region to the other with absolutely no problem. And with all this solution, you archive this high availability and disaster recovery with many 9s.
Right. No, this has been awesome. And I really appreciate learning about not just the HA side, but also the DR sides, and how crucial like setting up the shares is, and also how it makes it easier once you set up the max shares during deployment. So thanks so much, Javier. This has been really useful. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our viewers have learned a lot. For our viewers, if you like this video, go ahead, give it a like, subscribe to our channel, leave us a comment, and let us know what you're doing for HADR in Azure VMs. And we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.